In this video, I am going to teach you the basics of photography. We will go through all of the main details on how to use your camera. Now, grab a pen and paper as we'll be going through a lot in this video. Taking notes and practicing is key. Remember, you can always come back to this video for reference. We will be talking about the exposure triangle in its simplest form. In this series of videos aimed at beginner photographers, I will be explaining all of the aspects of photography and answering any questions that you might have. Once you have this basic understanding of photography and a solid foundation to lean on, we can then build upon this knowledge and get creative later down the line. First learn to ride your bike and then we can do wheelies later. Make sure that you stay tuned until the end of this video, as I will be sharing my own secret tip on how to get correct exposure on your photos every single time. Now, photography is all about light. If you can get a good understanding of light, you'll truly be well on your way to producing fantastic photos. We gauge the brightness using something called stops of light. And to handle these light stops, we turn to a concept which some of you might have already heard of. It's called the exposure triangle. Think of the exposure triangle as having three main important parts. 1, shutter speed. 2, aperture. And 3, ISO. These three make up the exposure triangle, and each of them does something special to control how much light enters your camera. Okay, so let's talk about the first component of the exposure triangle. When we take a photo, light enters through the lens, travels past the shutter and reaches the camera sensor. The shutter is like a gate in front of your sensor. It opens and lets light in, and then it closes again. If you choose a fast shutter, it means that the gate opens and closes quickly, much like how your eyelid works. This results in less light entering the camera and reaching the camera sensor because the gate is open for a shorter space of time. On the flip side, when you opt for a slower shutter speed, it means that the shutter stays open for a longer duration, allowing more light to enter the camera and reach the camera sensor. Now, from a creative standpoint, consider shutter speed as a choice between capturing a frozen moment in time or having a bit of blur and movement in your image. Generally, especially in scenarios like portraits, wildlife photography, we prefer a faster shutter speed so that we can freeze the action. So shutter speeds like 1/250 or 1/400 or 1/800 and so on. For example, if we are taking a photo of a portrait of a person, they will be moving just a little bit, swaying side to side. So a shutter speed of 1/250 should do the job in freezing the motion and getting us a nice sharp image. But on the other hand, if we were taking pictures of a basketball game and the players and balls will be moving a lot faster, so we'll have to choose a much higher shutter speed to freeze the motion, something like 1/800 or even faster depending on how much light is available. A top tip is to always do a few test shots and then zoom into these images and check that they are nice and sharp. If they are not, it means that your shutter speed was too slow and it just needs to be adjusted. Remember, to freeze action, you can never have a shutter speed that is too fast. Now, if you have a tripod to steady your camera, you might be into night photography or landscape or architecture. In these situations, you can offer a much slower shutter speed. Speeds like 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds, and so on. This is because the tripod keeps your camera stable, nice and steady, and it prevents any movement of your hand. Also, the subject is not moving. Landscape, architecture, they're stationary. Now, a common issue I see a lot of beginners face in photography is getting blurry images, And surprisingly, it's often not the fault of the camera or the gear, but rather the shutter speed not being fast enough. To ensure sharp images, a helpful tip is to use a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second or faster. This does depend on other factors like choice of lens or the type of subject or how steady your hand is and so on. Use this as a general guide, a general rule. Alright, let's talk about aperture in simple terms. Imagine the camera is your eye and the aperture is the pupil of your eye. Aperture is the size of the opening in your camera's lens. A small aperture like a high f number, such as f16, means that the opening is tiny, nice and small, like squinting your eye. This lets less light into your camera. A large aperture, like a low f number, such as f2, means the opening is wide open, like opening your pupil wide. This allows more light into your camera and hits your sensor. Aperture is measured in what we call f-stops. The closer to 0, this means a larger aperture, like f1.4 or f2, is like having your camera's eye wide open, letting in lots of light. Great for low light situations or when you want a nice blurry background. Larger numbers, this indicates a smaller aperture, such as f11 or f16. This is like squinting your camera's eye, allowing less light to come in. This is useful for bright scenes or when you want everything in your photo to be in focus. So when you see those f numbers like f1.4 or f2 or f16, just remember, smaller the number, bigger the opening, the larger the number, the smaller the opening. Now, when we talk about aperture creatively, it's usually about managing something called the depth of field. The depth of field is about deciding how much of the picture will be in focus. With larger apertures like f1.2 for example, you get a really shallow depth of field. This means that only a small part of the image is sharp, drawing attention to the main subject. The rest of the picture becomes beautifully blurry, making your subject stand out from the frame. Wider apertures are often favored in portrait photography because they make the person stand out from the soft, blurry background. This background blur is commonly referred to as bokeh. Now, on the other hand, if you're into landscape photography or capturing buildings, architecture, you'd prefer a deeper depth of field. This helps keep everything nice and sharp and in focus. In such cases, you would go for a smaller aperture like f8, f11, f16, and so on, so that everything stays in focus. Remember, if you prefer fewer things to be in focus and you want your subject to really stand out from the background, opt for a lower f-stop like f2 or even f1.2. If you want more things in focus, use a higher f-stop like f8, f11, f16, and so on. So we've covered quite a bit so far. If you found value in this video, kindly hit the like and subscribe button. This way, I will know to create more content like this for you in future. Feel free to drop any questions in the comments and I'll be sure to respond to you. The final component of the exposure triangle is called ISO, which stands for International Organization for Standardization. It is not something that you need to remember, and most photographers don't even know what it stands for. ISO in photography refers to the sensitivity of your camera's sensor to light. Here's a simple breakdown to help you understand ISO. The ideal ISO number allows your camera to achieve good image quality by letting in the right amount of light to hit the image sensor. Low ISO values are better in well-lit situations. On the other hand, when less light is available, you might need a higher ISO to compensate. High ISOs increase the camera's light sensitivity, which is ideal for low light situations. Again, this all depends on a number of factors, on your creative output and what you're trying to achieve as an end goal for your photography. Common stops of ISO are 100, 200, 400, 600, 1000, 1200, and so on. See, ISO does not have a direct creative effect on your photos like shutter speed or aperture. Remember how a slow shutter speed will give you a blurry look? This could be used to show movement in sports and dance, for example. And a low f-stop will give you that blurry background look, which is commonly used in portrait photography, as we want the focus to be on the person and not what is going on in the background. So because of this, you should always concentrate on adjusting your shutter speed and aperture and have these as your priority. High ISO numbers will start to introduce noise and grain into your photos, though this is largely dependent on the quality of your camera body. Now, a lot of beginner photographers think that this is a really big deal, and they always keep their ISO really low as possible, even if this means messing up their shutter speed and aperture. This is a really big mistake. Your shutter speed and aperture are always the most important settings. Getting these correct first, and then if you need to adjust your ISO, do it. If you get this wrong, you could end up with blurry images or have a depth of field that you did not want. Now, with a high ISO, you can reduce the noise in post-production in softwares such as Lightroom, but you can never, and I mean never, unblur a blurry photo. So now that we have learned about the exposure triangle, try this practice tutorial for yourself. When going out to take a photo, let's say that we are doing street photography. I want my subject to be frozen, meaning that I do not want them to be blurry, showing any movement. This is the case most of the time. So I know that I want a minimum shutter speed of 1/250 of a second to freeze the motion. If it is daytime, this will most probably be a lot higher. Remember that you can never go wrong with a fast shutter speed. You are either freezing the motion or not. So for example, 1/250 and 1/2000 will both freeze motion. Your selection just depends on the amount of light that is available to you at the given time. So once you've got your shutter speed selected, you've done a couple of test shots, you zoomed in to make sure they're nice and sharp, then I think about my aperture. Do I want everything that I can see in the scene to be in focus? Or do I want a single subject to be in focus and stand out from the background? So remember, this changes when we are taking pictures of a person. We would normally want the person to stand out from the background, right? So we would use a larger aperture or a low f-stop, f1.2, f2.8, depending on what lens you're using at the time. If we are taking pictures of a landscape or a building, or maybe a crowd of people, we would want the entire picture to be in focus. So we would use a smaller aperture, a higher f-stop, like f6, f8, f11, and so on. Now that I have my shutter and my aperture set, lastly, I will adjust my ISO accordingly. Now, you can set this to auto ISO if you wish and allow the camera to select the correct ISO for you. As you get more advanced and skilled, you will then start to do this manually depending on your creative output of your image. It's always a good idea to get as close as you can to the final image in camera and not rely heavily on the editing process. If the image that we have just taken is too dark and we cannot go lower on our shutter speed because we're already at 1/250 of a second, I will then increase my ISO because I've already selected my aperture depending on the image that I am taking. On the other hand, if my image is too bright and my aperture is set, I will then increase my shutter to go even faster. Remember that you can never have a shutter speed that is too fast. It's either freezing motion or it is not. It is always a good idea to zoom into your photos after you've taken them to make sure that they are nice and sharp. You can do this on all digital cameras these days. I mean, you can even do it on a smartphone. If the picture is blurry, you will then need to adjust your shutter speed accordingly. If the entire area you want to be in focus is not in focus, then you will need to adjust your f-stop accordingly. For example, if we are taking a picture of a group of people and some people are standing behind others, you might be taking a wedding photo or just, a group of people where you have a front row, a middle row and a third row. You might find that the front row is in focus, but the people standing behind them are out of focus. In this situation, you will need to have a higher f-stop, like f6, f8, and increase the depth of field. Now, you might be thinking, how do we actually know if a picture is properly exposed or not? Well, you always want to go by the data and not just rely on what your eye thinks it can see. My secret tip for correct exposure is to use the brightness histogram, and this can be found on all digital cameras. The histogram is a graph that measures the brightness of our image. The horizontal axis moves from pure black on the left-hand side of the histogram through shadows, midtones, highlights, all the way to the brightest of whites on the right-hand side. So here you can see that I'm increasing my shutter speed, meaning that less light is hitting the camera sensor. And you can clearly see that the data on the histogram is moving all the way to the left. This is telling us that the image will be on the darker side. Now, if we make our shutter speed slower, allowing more light to enter our camera and hit the sensor, we can see that the data is now moving to the right-hand side, showing us that more light is hitting the camera sensor and that we will have a brighter image. What we want is all the data on the graph and nothing to be cut off left or right. The histogram is now telling us that we have correct exposure for the image. I'm going to give you another top tip. And this top tip is to never delete any of your photos when you're out there taking pictures. This is because you can and you will learn a lot from these images when you get back to the big screen. No matter how bad you think they might be, you will notice where you made mistakes and you can adjust for these mistakes next time you are out there taking photos. Okay, so we've been through quite a lot in this video. I really hope you took some notes and I hope you learned something. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing at all and it really helps me continue to produce these free videos, this free content just for you. Do make sure that you join the private Facebook group. There's a link in the description below this video. There you'll have direct access to myself so you can ask me any questions that you wish. You can post your photos for review and meet like-minded people. Also, you can hear about the fantastic workshops that I have coming up. So stay tuned for the next video in this beginner's guide to photography. And of course, make sure you get out there and take those photos.